Okay, welcome everybody to the second day of the North American Society Student Research Forum. So today we're going to have undergraduates present. So everybody who's presenting today is either currently enrolled in an undergraduate program or was recently in an undergraduate program and is presenting something that they did in that program. So we're going to have two sessions. So the first one will be starting shortly, and then we're going to take a 15-minute break from at my time. It will be 1:45 until 2. But we'll keep the session on. We're going to keep the recording on, and people can just take a break. So right now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Katya Jordan from Brigham Young University, who is going to chair our first session.
Well, hello there. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to chair the session. It's a great honor. We do have 3 speakers today, and in the interest of time, I will just say your name, your affiliation, and your title. If there's anything else in particular that you would like to say about yourself before you start actually presenting your paper, feel free to add. So our first speaker is Shudi Yang at Fudan University. And the topic of her presentation is Well Go, Love, Ivan Karamazov Unveiled and the Pro and Contra Debate Revisited. Shudi, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jordan. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here and to share with you my paper on the Brothers Karamazov entitled Ivan Karamazov Unveiled. My name is Shudi Yang. It is pronounced just like Judy. I am currently an undergraduate student at Fudan University. So my presentation today will be divided into 3 parts. So first, we'll start with a brief introduction of this paper's central problematic, and then we will move on to a close reading of the image of Ivan Karamazov. And finally, with Ivan Karamazov Unveiled, we can approach the famous pro and contra debates in a different light. Okay, let's begin. So as the writer of the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky named only 2 books of the Brothers Karamazov as the culminating points of the novel, namely Book 5, Pro and Contra, and Book 6, The Russian Monk. Those 2 books were not written in isolation. Instead, they engage in a dialogical relationship with one another, and it's the relationship that connects them together. On the one hand, Ivan's rebellion already presupposes an orthodox position of the pros to rebel against. And on the other hand, Book 6 was, from the very beginning, designed to be, I quote, answer to these negative aspects, end of quote. And in the setting of a novel, what we have here is a personification of dialectics. While only justified belief can save a skeptic from unconstructive despair, Ivan's doubts are incorporated into the prose thinking as important internal reflection that help avoid dogmatism. As Dostoevsky himself wrote later that year, I quote, "I do not recognize and believe in Christ like a little boy. My Hosanna has gone through a huge smelter of doubts, as the devil says in the same novel of mine." End of quote. So now that we have a debate in front of us, a natural curiosity will be, then who is the winner? Traditional interpretation tends to hold that Zosima's doctrine is ineffectual. But as Taras pointed out, at the turn of the century, there was a revival of religious reading of Dostoevsky's works. However, this issue is still far from being settled. Even Joseph Frank, who is generally sympathetic with Zosima's teaching, wrote in the same year as Taras wrote his own essay, wrote, Book 6, I quote, lacks the powerful environment to which it is meant to respond, end of quote. Facing this dilemma, this article represents another attempt to contextualize the debate by refocusing on the image of Ivan Karamazov, the rebellious speaker of the contra-values. I argue that this attempt is in line with the author's own scheme of the novel. According to a letter written in 1876, Dostoevsky was tired of describing social issues at large and decided to explore the specifics of the young generation and contemporary Russian families in his forthcoming novel. The latter idea, namely the Russian family, has been pithily summarized by scholars as the accidental family. However, the former topic, namely the younger generation, receives relatively less attention than it deserves. Therefore, I would like to bring more attention to the childhood experiences of the Karamazov brothers, who are all fairly young in the novel and therefore belong to the young generation, as the author himself was concerned with. Okay, so who is Ivan Karamazov? How he became what he is? Here, oh, sorry. So we have here an entry of Dostoevsky's notebook for September 1874. It was later recognized by Leonid Grossman as the earliest note for the Brothers Karamazov. So we can see here, originally, the story involves only two brothers. The elder one can be easily recognized as the prototype of Dmitry Karamazov. And the younger one is also identifiable as Ivan Karamazov for his romantic entanglement with his brother's fiancée. So interestingly, Ivan was already there in the earliest stage of the novel, and he was originally assigned the role of murderer, until Dostoevsky somehow changed his mind. And when it comes to the final version of the Brothers Karamazov, it is true that Ivan's personal history is depicted much more briefly than his other brothers. However, I argue that chapter 3, book 1, already offers us sufficient details. There is even more to learn from the thorough depiction of Alyosha's childhood, since he spent the first decade of his life with his brother Ivan. In this respect, I would like to bring more attention to what Alyosha had, yet Ivan missed. According to the narrator, Ivan was born in the first year of his father's second marriage, and he's 3 years older than Alyosha. They were abandoned at the age of 4 and 7, respectively, after their mother's death. With his extraordinary talent, Ivan already realized that he was living on Polinov's charity at the age of 10 and left his benefactor's house at around 13. He was struggling financially at college, but refused to ask for help from home and was even ashamed for having Fyodor Pavlovich as his father. That is to say, he had around 3 years of stable and loving family life. In contrast, being under 4 years old when Sofia Ivanovna died, Alyosha remembered his mother, I quote, "of no doubt just like through a dream," end of quote. And when the brothers were adopted by Polenov, Alyosha, I quote, "for a long time even grew up in his family," end of quote. And his benefactor, I quote, came especially to love the younger one, Alexei, end of quote. Strikingly, the narrator intervenes exactly at this point and reminds us that, I quote, I ask the reader to notice this from the very beginning, end of quote. There is a considerable degree of continuity between Ivan's miserable childhood upbringing and his argument in Book 5, which start from the question of love, then to that of children, and finally to that of God. And while Dostoevsky himself maintains that Ivan's discourse is, I quote, completely based on reality, end of quote, our re-examination above has just added another personal emotional layer to the picture. However, compared with continuity, it is the discrepancies between Ivan's person and his speech that matter the most to our interpretation. For here, most of the vulnerabilities of his eloquent speech can be detected. The character is known for his double-sidedness. For instance, on the issue of suffering children, Terrace once complained that, I quote, Ivan does not really care about the children whose sufferings he describes so eloquently, end of quote. Likewise, Rosenschild criticizes, I quote, Ivan never shows love for real children, end of quote. This confusion applies to other fictional characters as well. For example, in his conversation with Father Zosima, Ivan is depicted to behave strangely with an inexplicable smile, sorry. But for whom? The answer is other character around him in the fictional world. But is that the whole picture? Does he really have no stance at all, other than being a paradoxalist? Well, I would like to say no, because there are cases in which he's more sincere. For example, when he is in front of Alyosha. I would like to emphasize that the trusting bond between these two brothers is mutual. Alyosha speaks to Ivan, I quote, I have figured out something inside you, and it is only since this morning, end of quote. Ivan also reveals his heart to Alyosha willingly. I quote, I want to know you and to let you know myself, end of quote. Dostoevsky himself made the same point that Ivan, I quote, would never have spoken if it had not been for the accidental, sudden sympathy for his brother Alexei, end of quote. Therefore, I assign more weight to Ivan's confession before Alyosha to decide the actual side he takes. For instance, in response to the suspicion against his real attitude toward children, he confessed to Alyosha that, I quote, I like Lisa, I lied, I like her, end of quote. It is also in front of Alyosha that he revealed his ultimate insecurity about Christian faith. While having dinner with Fyodor Pavlovich, Ivan made a sensational assertion that, I quote, there's no God, a complete zero, end of quote. However, he admitted later that he only did this to make fun of Alyosha, and even made a claim that, I quote, I have faith, я верю, end of quote. Hence, Ivan never sincerely celebrates a total nihilistic worldview. Though he bluffed once that, I quote, the world stands on absurdity, end of quote, he was later driven mad by the devil's parody of exact idea. His suicidal tendency could not be more obvious, even under the cover of his use of metaphors, that he should drop his cup and return his entrance ticket. His splintered personality, the devil, also discloses that he's in so much pain that he seeks to hang himself. The contradiction between his fruitless search for the meaning of life and his longing for it creates a fatal dilemma that calls for an urgent solution. His irrational preference is clearly indicated in his famous claim, I quote, I want to live, I live, even if it is against logic, end of quote. With all the arguments we just went through, I see no reason not to take his opening lines before his rebellion seriously. I quote, my dear brother, I don't want to corrupt you. Neither do I want to push you away from your stance. Maybe I want to heal myself with you, end of quote. So finally, we arrive at the central argument of this paper. That is, Ivan did not start the debate with the intention to win it. Instead, he provoked the debate to be convinced by his counterparts, to seek satisfactory answer from them, so as to solve his own existential crisis. So in light of this, the only question left is, did the prose offer a satisfactory answer or not? I would like to say yes, but through my rehearsals of this presentation, I realized that there might not be enough time for me to cover the third section in full. So I have attached the link in the chat room to the full article if any of you would be interested. What we have worked on is not far away from drawing this conclusion, but with the concern of time, I will only outline the basic reasoning here. I shall argue that the response of the prose can also be reorganized following the logic of love, love, children, and God. The prose do not have severe divergence with Ivan on the first two issues. And for the third one, they made a detour from Christ to Job and then to humanity and life itself. And that would be all for my today's presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Shudi. You were right at 15-minute cutoff. It's perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, we're saving questions till after, right, Kate? Is that what you said? Okay. So our next speaker is going to be Oscar Pavlove at the University of Kansas. And the title of his talk is Kino Dostoevskого, Poetic Documentary.
Yes. All right. Hello, everyone. Very, very excited to be here. And I'm very excited to be able to follow Shudi's excellent presentation, which would be that's very helpful to me, actually. And we're also talking about Brothers Karamazov, but in a very different way. Our subject today is cinema of Dostoevsky. But I think before we get into that, it'll be helpful for us to get on the same page with regard to cinema. What I mean when I use the word cinema, different people mean different things by that word. So if you're already familiar with the work of Andrei Tarkovsky, this will be a bit of a refresher for you. Film is the only artistic medium that works directly with material reality. So unlike in theater, there's no representational element. Unlike in literature, there is no interpretive element, at least in terms of external events. The film image is an image of life itself. So the material with which the film artist works is time. And this is not time as an intellectual concept. This is time as lived experience. This is physical time. So as in life, in film, watching a film, the emotional experience emerges from engagement with material reality. It's important to note that for as long as events are being photographed, for as long as light is bouncing off a real object and passing through a camera lens and then imprinting an image of the world on film, as long as all that is happening, it'll always be impossible to escape the material reality of the film image. Film will always have an appearance of absolute reality. Now, when I use the word cinema, I don't mean it as a qualitative judgment. I do use the word movies and cinema to refer to different things, but these are not two ends of a sliding scale of quality. This isn't a question of good and bad. These are just two completely distinct entities that have to be approached in completely different ways, both by the creator and by the audience. Cinema really is an element, and this element can either be present in a film or not present in a film. And this element makes itself felt when the undercurrent that is running through and linking shots is not plot, but time. So if we think about in movies, if images are building blocks that are arranged in a sequence to tell a story, in cinema, the image is a container for time. You may be familiar with the quote from Andrei Tarkovsky, «Кино — это мозаика из времени». Cinema is a mosaic made of time. All right, so now I'll present you with a rule, and then I'll immediately explain why we need to break this rule when we're approaching a film adaptation of Brothers Karamazov. So here's the rule. The artist should be invisible. The artist should make every effort to erase all trace of their presence. The artist should not be leaving their fingerprints all over the work. In order for cinema to work on the audience, for the emotional experience of cinema to manifest, the audience has to be able to accept the film world as a second reality and not a created thing. So the audience has to be actively engaged through the image to the life within the image, and not a passive receiver of an aesthetic creation. Artifice, the presence of artifice, when it is obvious that you're looking at something that has been created, that creates a barrier between life and the observer. It creates distance. And in cinema, we need things to be immediate. We need things to be clear and direct. But here's the thing. Here's where things get interesting. In Brothers Karamazov, the writer is not invisible, but the writer is not Dostoevsky. In Brothers Karamazov, the world of the novel is being created by a person that is situated within the world of the novel. So these appear to be real events that are simply being chronicled by an ordinary townsperson who is living in this area, who's been collecting information. So he is not an author necessarily. He is more akin to a documentarian. So it is my belief that a film of Brothers Karamazov should be approached the same way, not as narrative, but as documentary. So the way I think of this is a film whose events have no author. These are real conversations. These are real moments in time that are being filmed spontaneously by an amateur cameraman. Except we have an advantage over a true documentary, and that advantage is that we know what is going to happen. More importantly, we understand very, very intimately the inner world of a moment. We understand the emotional movement, sort of the current of feeling flowing through a scene. So even if we don't know exactly physically how events will ultimately manifest, and actually it's better if we don't know exactly, even if we don't know, we're able to anticipate, because we know the direction things are flowing. So that means that we can be, for each moment, in just the right spot with just the right lens. We can be ready to capture these events as they happen, however they end up happening. So we are creating the conditions for spontaneous life to emerge. We are inviting the unpredictable and then capturing it on film. So really, this is not a created film. This is not a designed film. It is a captured film or attempted film. But of course, this is not actually a documentary. This is a work of fiction. So it has to be written. So let's talk about adaptation. What I have found personally is that oftentimes a literal one-to-one direct, very, very accurate translation fails to capture the feeling of the original text. To me personally, and really this is especially true for cinema, for me, ideas are always going to be less important than feelings. And this is especially true in dialogue. If we think about what a conversation is two souls, two human souls, each of which has its own private world. They've each been living in the world up to this point with their own private experiences, and they've reached this point, and each of them is charged with a very, very particular, very, very complex and really inexpressible feeling that you really can't put into words. And so it is my belief that the reason people talk is to be understood, but not in an intellectual sense. I don't mean that in the sense of do you comprehend this intellectual concept. I mean understanding as in being deeply felt. I think people want to be seen, deeply seen and felt, and touched on a deep level. So really, people are looking for emotional intimacy more than anything else. And really, so words in a conversation are just a byproduct of this process of knowing. If we think about an ocean of feeling, there are movements deep beneath the surface, sometimes very, very violent movements, and then bubbles rise to the surface, and then on the surface they pop, and that pop is a word. To me, it's not any more important than that. So really, to me, a conversation, really, the words could be anything. I mean, that's not exactly true, but the content of a conversation, the subject that is being discussed, is really secondary for me, especially in cinema. So now, specifically looking at this film, the first scene of the film, which is written, the screenplay is for this scene is. I'll say complete. I'll explain in a little bit what I mean by these quotes. The first scene of the film is actually from book 11, which is Ivan's book. It is the conversation between Lisa and Alyosha in the chapter A Little Demon. This is the conversation about the pineapple, if you know that conversation. I won't say any more if you have not, but it's my favorite conversation in the book. And it's so even though it is 75% of the way through the novel, it presented itself to me quite naturally as the right place to begin. And this will, just as the book is not told in sequence, the film will also not be told in sequence. So approaching the scene, it really required of me an intuitive process as opposed to an intellectual process. If I were writing the scene for theater, I think it would be more natural for me to say, so there were three versions of the scene, and the first version was written in this way. It was, okay, here's the Russian text, here's a direct English translation, and then let's sort of doctor it to make it feel more natural so that it can be spoken freely by an English speaking actor. If I was doing the film adaptation for theater, that's probably where I would stop. But I really have an issue with the written word, especially the typed word. I really prefer to move away from it. It's that sort of rigid structure, even just visually seeing it and typing it and seeing it as I type it. It's it doesn't flow the way that thought flows in conversation. So really what this meant is that this scene could only be written out loud, which is the way that the third and final version of the scene, that what I was building toward, the way that version was written. And I'm sure you all already know that Brothers Karamazov was written primarily out loud, dictated by Dostoevsky's to Anna Grigorievna. And maybe not coincidentally, that ended up being the appropriate way to approach the scene. So writing this scene really meant bringing myself into alignment with the inner worlds of these characters, bringing myself into that place, understanding how they've been feeling lately, generally what their attitudes are toward the world, life, God and spirituality, toward themselves. And then really, really more importantly, specifically in this exact moment, sitting down here in this room across from this other person, what is happening inside of me? And this was less it wasn't like a bullet list of, okay, these are the thoughts I need to be thinking about. It was more the way that an actor, so my first degree is in drama. So this was more like preparing for an acting scene than writing. So essentially, I brought myself into this emotional space and then acted out the scene from start to finish into a voice memo, and then made an exact transcript of this voice memo, and that's what you see in the screenplay if you choose to read it. That's all for now. I'll answer your questions later, but that's all I have right now.
Thank you very much, Oscar. That was very, very interesting. Okay, and we'll move on to our third panelist so we can get to our questions and answers. Okay, our third presenter is going to be Camille Collins from Colgate University. And the title of her talk is Representation of Russian National Identity in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. Camille, your turn.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'll just share my. Okay. Can you all see? Okay, perfect. So my research paper is called Representation of Russian National Identity in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And today I will be discussing how the character tropes and dynamics from Dostoevsky's novella parallel Russia's national character and self-image, as well as its relationship with the West. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of history. When Peter I was a young man before he was Tsar, he toured around Northern Europe, and this trip was incredibly influential and served as a source of inspiration for the actions he would take as ruler. He was impressed by European lifestyle, art, and science, and because of his travels, he became determined to bring European Enlightenment ideals to Russia. During his reign from 1682 to 1725, he overhauled the military to rival major powers in Western Europe and created a secular educational system. And in his efforts, he relied on Western European advisors for counsel. One such man was philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, who, quote, recommended that Peter appoint foreigners to jumpstart the process in Russia, and at the same time found libraries, museums, and research institutes capable of disseminating existing knowledge and of generating new ideas for improvement and economic development. Later in the 1800s, Peter's Europeanization of Russia, the infiltration of European ideas, scholars, and culture would become a major point of contention. At the beginning of the 19th century, salons and thick journals served as platforms for Russian intelligentsia to discuss this subject. Out of these salons and thick journals came questions about what Russia's identity consisted of. As a vast empire, Russia was and is made up of numerous groups of people, ethnicities, languages, and cultures. It lies in both Asia and Europe, and this unique geographic situation gave way to questions about whether Russia was essentially European or its own entity entirely. So Peter Shadev, a philosopher and member of the intelligentsia, wrote a letter which was published in a thick journal, which claimed that, quote, Russia was a cultural non-entity, suspended uneasily between the civilizations of Europe and Asia. It had not borrowed anything culturally fruitful from either. There's an incredibly strong reaction to this letter, out of which two main schools of thought emerged, the Westernizers and Slavophiles. The Slavophiles believed that Russia had her own unique identity and that Russians should not attempt to become European. From their point of view, Peter the Great had made a grave error in his reforms. He should have invested in developing Russia's own traditions and building her unique strengths rather than trying to emulate Europe. The Westernizers believed that Peter the Great breathed new life into Russia. They believed that her dominance on the world stage could only be achieved by studying and copying the successes of Europe. Both sides envisioned a future in which Russia was a dominant world power, but they saw different methods of achieving that vision. Fyodor Dostoevsky himself was a devout Slavophile. His ideology is apparent as he was an active participant in the debates of the 19th century. He wrote in thick journals to argue his beliefs on the Westernizer Slavophile debate. Less studied, however, is the way that the debate and climate of the time shines through his fictional works. A prime example, which parallels the Russian political and cultural climate of the time, is his novella, Notes from Underground. Notes from Underground was published in 1864 during a time when Dostoevsky was becoming even more strongly aligned with the Slavophile ideology. It is written in two parts from the perspective of the underground man. Part one is written in monologue form on the topic of his view on his identity and place in the world. So one topic that the underground man emphasizes is his desire to be definable. In chapter 6, he writes that he would not even mind being called a, quote, sluggard. How very pleasant it would have been to hear that of oneself. It would mean that I was positively defined. It would mean that there was something to say about me. Here the reader learns that the underground man mourns the fact that he is nothing in particular. He is not a man who has achieved a lot, and he is not a man who has achieved an impressive amount of nothing. He is neither successful nor significantly lazy. The underground man finds his lack of definable character to be agonizing. His self-respect is diminished by the fact that in his eyes he has no qualities to respect, even if they are negative ones. Another purpose that part one serves is to demonstrate the underground man's figurative underground location. He's not literally left society to live in a cave or other secluded location. Rather, the underground man has cut off all friends and loved ones to the point that he barely interacts with people at work. In chapter 2, he describes how, quote, "The more conscious I was of goodness and of all that was good and beautiful, the more deeply I sank into my mire, and the more ready I was to sink in it altogether." The more the underground man saw that he was not as good as other people, the more he withdrew from their company, which leads him to the question in chapter 3, quote, "Can a man of perception respect himself at all?" This question reveals the origin of the underground man's cynicism. He sees himself as a man of perception, and this perception makes him see that he is relatively worse to all the people around him. Most significantly, the underground man ends part 1 by describing his desire to break out from underground and rejoin the world. It seems that he has not found it yet, but he is actively searching for it. So part 1 takes on the perspective of a Westernizer. The underground man himself is symbolic of Russia, and in the same way that he agonizes over his own lack of achievement, the Westernizers saw Russia as lacking any definable or accomplished culture. In the early 19th century, soldiers returning from battle against Napoleon's forces in Europe saw that while Europe was discussing the rights of the individual and the freedom of nations, Russia remained autocratic. Much as the underground man saw emptiness in his own life, the Westernizers saw Europe as an example of what Russia lacked. So Vissarion Belinsky, a prominent Westernizer, wrote, quote, "Everything that makes one proud of being a man, all this is the result of the development of European life. Everything human is European." The Westernizers' vision for Russia meant joining the Western world. Russia would learn from these cultures and in that way build and revive her own. This can be compared to the underground man's desire to come out from underground. He knows that he must rejoin society if he is to create the real and solid life which he so craves. In part 2 of Notes from Underground, the underground man describes to the reader multiple interactions he has with other people. It is an honest account which allows for the opportunity to relate his personal psyche to that of the Russian people. Part 2 begins with the underground man telling the reader how he feels about himself and his colleagues. He oscillates in his feelings for his peers. He describes, quote, "Of course I hated my fellow clerks one and all, and I despised them all. Yet at the same time I was, as it were, afraid of them." By describing his feelings toward his peers he is surrounded by most often, we gain insight into his character. We can understand that the underground man is someone who feels superior in his intelligence toward his peers, yet feels such disgust toward himself that overall he sees himself as alien and separate from them. And he resents his peers for making him feel that way, even though it is self-imposed. Next, the underground man describes to the reader the events of a late night walk. He passes a tavern and sees a man get thrown out of the window, and he feels envious of the man and decides to enter the tavern in hopes that he too might get thrown out. The underground man is so isolated that he craves attention of any kind, even if it is negative. Once in the tavern, he gets in the way of an officer who, quote, "took me by the shoulders and without a word, without a warning or explanation, moved me from where I was standing to another spot and passed by as though he had not noticed me." The underground man writes, "I could have forgiven blows, but I could not forgive his moving me without noticing me." It is clear that the underground man simply wants to be acknowledged by this officer. This burning desire to be acknowledged leads him to develop a psychotic obsession with meeting the officer again. He lays out complex plans to buy new clothes, and he finds out where the officer walks around the city. The irony of the situation lies in the fact that the officer never thinks twice about the underground man and likely does not even remember his face. On the day of the operation, to bump into the officer again, he follows through. Quote, "I closed my eyes and we ran full tilt, shoulder to shoulder against one another. I did not budge an inch and passed him on perfectly equal footing." Despite this, the officer does not react at all. In fact, he doesn't even seem to notice that anything happened. He just keeps walking. No matter how big of an obstacle the underground makes himself, he is simply not acknowledged. Thirdly, the underground man describes how he invites himself to a dinner outing with some men he went to school with. They are celebrating a friend named Zverkov, who is going away to serve as an officer in the army. And the men who arranged the dinner point out to the underground man that he was never friends with them, even in school, but they allow him to join out of politeness. The night of the dinner, the group of men change the meeting time and forget to tell the underground man. Whether or not it was on purpose, they treat him without consideration, just as the officer did. He writes, quote, "No one paid attention to me, and I sat crushed and humiliated." During the dinner, the underground man vies for the group's attention, and in doing so shames himself. He worked so hard to show off his intelligence and win the acceptance of the group that he ultimately shows his true insecurity and incivility. After he embarrasses himself, the underground man, quote, "waited with impatience for them to speak first, but alas, they did not address me. And oh, how I wished at that moment to be reconciled to them." Throughout the night, the reader sees how the underground man oscillates between admiration for his old schoolmates and hatred. Despite his distaste for these men, everything he does and says is in an effort to win their respect and admiration. Part 2 of Notes from Underground is illuminatory of the attitude that Russia held in regard to the West. Gary Cox, a political scientist at Stanford University, wrote of 2 responses that Russia has in the face of a foreign threat, which are triggered by deep national insecurities. The first is the assertive one, in which Russian superiority is declared irrationally and hyperbolically. Cox cites as an example the messianic call of Moscow as the third Rome after the fall of Constantinople. The second response is the submissive one. Cox describes this response as the appropriation of Western European cultures. Additionally, he lists the legend of the Varangian invitation, in which the tribes of Rus could not govern themselves, and as a solution, they invited the Vikings to rule over them. Cox writes, quote, "Whether or not this invitation actually occurred, its persistence as a cultural myth illustrates the tendency toward cultural dependence produced by a weak sense of national identity. Just as this legend has persisted as a key part of Russian tradition, the fear of foreign domination persists. Similarly, the underground man's fear of domination by his peers follows him through every aspect of his life. It is what persuades him to act in both assertive and submissive ways, in desperate gambles for the respect of the officer and for the respect of his old schoolmates." Geoffrey Hosking wrote in his account of Russian history, Russia and the Russians, that both Slavophiles and Westernizers were, quote, "steeped in resentment of a dominant and apparently superior neighboring civilization." Similarly, the underground man is disgusted by his peers' apparent dominance. His actions symbolize the self-damaging and often futile efforts made by Russia to put the West in its place. Russia sees itself as superior to the West, and therefore it is motivated by a deep national insecurity to do everything it can to make the rest of the world recognize this. The intellectuals, such as Dostoevsky, who led the Slavophile Westernizer debate, foresaw a great future for Russia, but under 2 different circumstances. The Westernizers believed that the first step to ultimate domination was apprenticeship under the West. They wanted to learn refinement and culture before bursting ahead as a world leader. The Slavophiles believed that Russia was already far more powerful and virtuous than the rest of the world, and that this should be acknowledged and celebrated. Fyodor Dostoevsky paralleled these debates in Notes from Underground. His personification of Russia in The Underground Man allowed for an exploration of the country's deepest insecurities and motivations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille. That was excellent. Okay, those are our three presentations, and let's give our audience a chance to ask questions. Would anyone like to start? Oh, Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. What a great start. Three fabulous presentations, very professional in all cases. So I have a question for Oscar. You talked about sort of the difficulties of adapting Dostoevsky for film. So I wondered if you could tell us, first of all, how did you kind of get to this point of writing your screenplay of the Brothers Karamazov? Where are you in the process? And also, what are some of the film adaptations of Dostoevsky texts that you think are the most effective, and have those kind of made any difference? Like, have those influenced you in thinking about your screenplay?
Those are excellent questions. Thank you very much. I think I'll start with the third first, because that's very, very interesting to me. So I will say, there is one film, one adaptation of Dostoevsky on film that I think is an extraordinary work of cinema. I wouldn't say necessarily that I wouldn't approach it the same way. It's an excellent film, but to me it doesn't feel like Dostoevsky. So a Dostoevsky novel was used to create an extraordinary work of art, but it doesn't really feel like Kino Dostoevskaya in the way that I conceptualize it. And that film is Norte: The End of History by Lav Diaz, a Filipino filmmaker. It's a fairly loose well, in some ways it's a loose adaptation of Crime and Punishment, but it's an extraordinary film. But then, so all of the versions of Brothers Karamazov that I have come across, I don't have the highest opinion of, which was kind of what motivated me to look at this, because really I mean, I'd say the primary reason why I'm pursuing this is because I want to see this. No one's made this, and I want to see it. I want to see it done in a particular way. Other films that are not related to Dostoevsky, but have the same sort of a similar sort of sensibility. First would be Ingmar Bergman's Persona, where there's kind of a strange there's the sense that you're watching a film, that these events have been filmed, but there's an inconsistency there, which is fun. Similar to how in Brothers Karamazov, the narrator, his physical presence is not consistent, which makes it more interesting. And then also Alexei German's Hard to Be a God is one of my very, very favorite films. And that's similar. It feels at times like there is a physical cameraman that is moving through space, and sometimes he's acknowledged by the characters, and sometimes he seems to be invisible or immaterial. So that's very interesting. What was there was a third what was the question in the middle? I think I skipped.
Sort of was it how you got to this? Like, what were the sort of how did you get to this process? Was that the one?
I think so,
Or
yes. Well, I think when I knew with certainty that Brothers Karamazov could be turned into a film was I was finishing the novel, and I was in this empty classroom in the film building at school, and no one ever came in this classroom. It was always just me. So I was sitting there. I was almost at the end, and I was very, very emotional, and I was sure no one was going to come in. And then the door opened, and this poor freshman girl walked in, and they had scheduled a test for that room. And actually was a little bit terrified, I think. So I had to clarify, no, I'm not upset. I'm not upset. I'm just crying over Dostoevsky. But I realized like that's the first time that a novel has affected me the way that a film has affected me. And also this is not a lot of times novels seem to lend themselves to film. I'm talking specifically about Hollywood because they they have a very clear narrative arc. There's sort of a narrative flow that would be easy to turn into spectacle. But this Brothers Karamazov, the novel, feels to me very cinematic in the sense that I understand cinema. In that it really doesn't necessarily have a narrative in the conventional sense. You're just popping in and visiting people, real people at these moments. So that's very, very interesting to me. Shudi?
Okay, yes, it's me. I just have a random association here because you mentioned that you think you can read Brothers Karamazov starting from chapter 11. And, I was thinking, oh, for me, it was book 5, because I started this novel from book 5 from The Legend of Inquisitor. So I was thinking, do you consider this as a trait of, the cinematic feature of this particular novel? Because I don't think this rule applies for other of Dostoevsky's works. If I start, for example, The Possessed from the middle, I would definitely get lost, I would say.
Yeah, I very much agree. And I think that's part of what lends itself to the sort of documentary approach as well. Because there isn't really a story being told. It's developing a space and developing a sort of interconnected system of events, developing a network of relationships, and then just going around and around and around and around. So every moment in Brothers Karamazov, and the same thing is true for cinema, every single and for life as well, every single moment has equal importance. It's not that there is a build-up to a point of interest, to a plot point that doesn't follow the traditional narrative arc. There's no like rising action and well, I mean, sort of there's a climax, but not really. It's really just like I said, sort of going around, and each time you go around, you understand things a bit better. But I've been popping back in as I've been working on this screenplay, just popping in at different places, and it's almost a book that can be read in any order, I think. I mean, if I would recommend people read it from start to finish, just because I think that's what Dostoevsky himself would recommend. But in theory, it could be read in any order.
Just in response to that, if you look at the letters which he wrote, or the notebooks, he talks about various different sections of it as being the culminating point, right? And you can't really have many culminating points, right? That suggests in a way that the whole of the book together, exists as the culminating point. So just to kind of back you up on that.
Okay. Any other questions for anyone
Katya,
else?
I think that there's a question in the
Oh,
chat
yeah.
from Eric Nyman. Do you want to read that?
Yes, I see
Yes,
it.
I'm reading.
Okay. I'm in transit. I cannot turn my camera, but I have a question coming for Shudi. Does your reading of the novel de-accentuate ideas and prioritize emotions? Does that make your reading essentially anti-Bakhtinian? Finally, your reading of Ivan reminds me of an insight of Levin's in Anna Karenina, a novel we know Dostoevsky was responding to. Levin realizes that winning an argument is less important than understanding your interlocutor. An argument, even about a political question, can always be seen as an attempt to learn to love the person you are talking to. It isn't about convincing your interlocutor at all.
Okay, this is a very huge topic. I would need some time to think about it. But I would like to make my stance on this because I would say, yes, my approach is anti-Bakhtinian. I actually devoted a special, I think a specific footnote in my article dealing with this question. I think my method is anti-Bakhtinian in, I think, two ways. So first, I constantly quote and refer to Dostoevsky's first-hand sources, like his own comments on his own work, like his own schemes of how this novel should be perceived. And second, when it comes to a certain dialogue, I think there is to be, I think there is a final answer, a final synthesis. Let's put it this way, instead of an answer or something, a final synthesis of this thesis antithesis process. So I think in this sense, I am anti-Bakhtinian, but surely I don't think I am anti-Bakhtinian in prioritizing emotions and neglecting ideas. I think I would put it in a exactly opposite way. I would like to say that Ivan never gives up his intellectual thirst for a convincing argument. That's why he provokes a debate in the first place, because he's still asking for a form of how to say, the form has to be intellectual. It has to be convincing instead of pure a pure miracle or a myth. So he did not take the final leap of faith. Even at the end of the novel, it remains as a mystery for us. But yeah, I don't think ideas are taken out of the novel in my interpretation. That's my own reading of this novel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts, questions? Yes, Natalie.
Yeah, so we heard a bit from Oscar about the background behind the motivation, and I'm always curious to know why we choose to spend the time we do and energy on a particular topic. So for both Shudi and Camille, I'm curious what sparked your inspiration. I guess maybe we can start with Camille because we heard from Shudi, and then Shudi after.
So my paper was a class project in which we were asked to write about anything we wanted. And I had read Crime and Punishment a couple times previously, and I wanted to expand my knowledge of Dostoevsky. So I did a little bit of research, and I thought that Notes from Underground would be a really great novel to pick apart and kind of look at the symbolism and see what I could find and see what I could relate to Russian history. And Notes from Underground was just a really great candidate. And I really enjoyed it. So I'm definitely going to be reading even more Dostoevsky after this.
Okay, I suppose it's my turn for this question. Okay. I think for me as well, the interest started with personal reading of Dostoevsky's work. I read Crime and Punishment. I read Notes from Underground in high school, but reading Dostoevsky, reading the Brothers Karamazov was actually the first time that I was touched by a work of Dostoevsky. And when it comes to the exact topic of this paper, it was because when I was reading this, I resonated so much with Ivan Karamazov. I feel like he and I have a lot in common. We both ask for answers in a form of intellectual debate. We are not satisfied with just some mythical form of miracle and something you should believe in. And actually, when I started writing a paper to build on my some of my ideas that sprang out when I was reading this novel, it was because I I was in the history of Russian literature course at my home institution, and then I was taught that Ivan is the embodiment of evil idea, and then I rebelled against this reading, and I wrote this essay, the first draft of this essay, as my course essay, in a way to communicate with my instructor back then. Yeah, so it's a long story.
Okay, thank you. Other comments, questions? Well, while you're thinking, I do have a question for Camille. I've always been intrigued by the order of, part one and the events of part one and part two in Notes from Underground. Because we know the things that happen in, described to us in part two happened before what we read about in part one. So I was wondering if you've considered how this order is important and what kind of effect the work would have had, and for the purposes of your argument, had he reversed the order and actually presented to us the events in chronological order. Would the argument still, would your argument still stand had he reversed the order?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting because Dostoevsky was actually more of he was more neutral earlier in his life. He actually was not particularly aligned with Slavophiles or Westernizers, and then he went to a work camp and met some people and did some thinking and came back a changed man. But no, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I wonder because a lot of the events in part two kind of, well, part one is very like demonstrative of the Westernizer point of view, and then part two kind of like ties both of them together. So I wonder if it would read the reader with a different sense of Dostoevsky's own point of view if it was reversed. But that's definitely something that I'd have to give some more thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Natalie. Natalie and then Kate.
I have a question for Oscar because my mind couldn't help when you were talking about the documentary style going to some examples in our own day. And I was thinking of The Office because that's like one of the most famous examples of our time. And it just kind of got me on this train of thought of wondering. Oh, and then you also talked about how important it was to capture the authenticity of dialogue, which I think is so huge, especially in translations over time. And so I was curious how much your screenplay is bringing in present culture, like modern day, to make it feel as if the reader is experiencing the Brothers Karamazov in their own time, or how much it stays rooted in the context in which it was written.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm very glad that you asked because I had originally included this in my presentation, but there wasn't enough time, so I cut this. So thank you so much. So I believe that there really shouldn't be any veil between the audience and the life within the film. And I think what I mean by that is as soon as you cross over from one language to another, especially when you're crossing over from one language to another across time and space and culture, if you stay right in the same place, it becomes like a shadow. it becomes sort of you're given the sense that this is sort of just like a pale, it's like an imitation of more real events that happened a different way somewhere else. So I think to really achieve the immediacy that this film needs, it needs to be set in present day, in Kansas, because that's where I am, and in English, and not just in English, but in contemporary vernacular, so in casual conversational language. Um, but with that in mind, these characters, I mean, they don't just talk like every like schlub on the street. I mean, like these are interesting people, so they talk in an interesting way. But it isn't. So and there are a few things here and there. I never went out of my way to bring in contemporary culture, but certain things. Like when Alyosha asked Lisa if she's still in the original novel, he asked her if she's still reading like bad books or like unhealthy literature, and to me in present day that's like listening to like true crime podcasts. And so like to me, even though it's different, it's like today that's what that would be. So all of the changes that I've made in bringing it up close to us are just to reduce the distance between the to facilitate an immediate engagement with the reality within the film.
Shall I go ahead now, Katya? So actually, in connection with the question that was just asked and in Oscar's response, so I wanted to, before I get into the kind of the next question, I just wanted to share a couple of films that I've seen recently that seem to be particularly good examples of Dostoevsky adaptations, or perhaps transpositions. And there are two films by Zeki Demirkubuz, who is a contemporary Turkish film director, who was involved in politics in his teens. He participated in radical politics in opposition to the Turkish regime in around 1980, and so this was when he was in his teens. So he was imprisoned, and he read Crime and Punishment in prison when he was 16. I'll give everyone a link in a minute. And he has two films. One is called Inside, which I think is from 2012, but I'll link to it afterwards, which is an adaptation of Crime and Punishment set in contemporary Ankara. And that is a really, I think, a remarkable, first of all, the fact that it's notes from Underground, to be able to kind of adapt notes from Underground to film. To me, it's kind of amazing. But what the effectiveness of what he does is kind of the mood. So he uses kind of certain aspects of film, so space in particular, a lot of spatialization, in order to kind of convey. He uses staircases and doors a lot to kind of convey the sort of liminality of the underground man. And then he also has another film, which I will also post in the link, which is about a screenwriter who's adapting Crime and Punishment for film. And so it focuses not on the film, but rather on the life of the screenwriter. And the screenwriter sort of is quite a sort of complicated character himself. So, for instance, he accuses his wife of having an affair, even though he himself is having an affair with the fellow director of his Crime and Punishment adaptation. And he also catches somebody burglarizing his apartment, and he then goes to his house and wants to cast him as the Raskolnikov in his film. So it's it's kind of inspired by and sort of engages with the idea of Crime and Punishment, but sort of by reframing it. So that definitely, if you haven't seen those two, I would really recommend those. Both of them are available on YouTube. But I sort of in a broader sense, and this is kind of in a way to all three. So it's interesting how we have a panel which is kind of goes from Notes from Underground, which in a way is kind of the sort of way into Dostoevsky's sort of great literary career, or the great part of his literary career, and Brothers Karamazov, the last work. And of course, Notes from Underground in formal scope is kind of, on the sort of on the minor side in terms of its at least word count. And then of course we go to Brothers Karamazov, which is one of his longest, if not his longest novel. And so I was just wondering, and of course we think of Notes from Underground as incredibly ideologically complex, as Camille showed in her presentation. As is Brothers Karamazov, which Shudi showed in hers. So I was just wondering, sort of what you see, whether you see a kind of, and this is a very broad question, so feel free to take whatever element you like, but sort of how we see the path from Notes from Underground to the Brothers Karamazov. Do you see that there are kind of similarities? Do you see the underground man kind of resurrected in Ivan Karamazov? Anybody have any thoughts about that? And again, this is a question to anybody and everybody.
I don't know that I can necessarily comment on this one because I haven't read the Brothers Karamazov. So sorry.
No problem. Definitely something you should do at next summer.
I have not yet read Notes from Underground, but I got it from my dad for Hanukkah, so I'll read it after he finishes it. But I'm familiar with the subject, and I think I'm interested in this idea of um of an individual who feels simultaneously that they are above and below the rest of society, and feels that there is another way of living, that maybe is not achievable, and sort of the struggle of the individual to either raise themselves out of their space or degrade themselves, to get to a place where they're comfortable, where they feel like they can live within their ideal. Yeah, that's interesting to me.
Okay. And for me, I have read both works, but I haven't thought about this question, like approach it from this angle. But I just had some thoughts, and then I would like to say that for me, the genealogy of the underground man from the Notes from Underground to the Brothers Karamazov can be traced, but for me, it kind of split in the Brothers Karamazov into Ivan and his double Smertsikov. I would say I cannot detect such cynicism in Ivan, and that pessimism in Ivan. I think it is best exemplified in the famous quote, and often misquote from Ivan, that if there is no God, then everything is permitted, as compared to Smertsikov's version, because there is no God, then everything is permitted. For Ivan, that would be hypothesis of something we cannot afford. So we have to try our best to build something so as not to fall into that situation. But for Smertsikov, the thing is darker for him. There is already no God. There is given. This is given. So therefore, the result is that now we can do whatever we want. And some random association here is his suicide note. In the, I think the second part, if you are using the 30 volumes version of his standardized complete works, Smertsikov left his suicidal note in which he wrote, I can't remember the exact words, but it is roughly that I did this just out of my own will. Therefore, no one should be blamed. Yeah, that's my thought on this issue. And that's just a very intriguing question.
Thank you. Other thoughts, questions? I have one little questions for Camille. And that's about the character of Lisa, who again shows up in part two. Since we're talking about, Westernizing and Slavophile influences, what do you make of the fact that she comes from Riga? I mean, Dostoevsky talks a lot about, St. Petersburg, the most premeditated city on the earth, things like that. But why do you think he chose Riga as a place of origin for Lisa?
That's an interesting question. I actually don't know that much about Riga. I'm assuming it's a smaller town. Probably, I mean, St. Petersburg was very wealthy and, named after Peter the Great. It was very advanced and European type city. So I would guess that Dostoevsky used that to kind of play into the underground man's superiority complex. Allowed him to like it gave him the need to manipulate her and attempt to show his dominance. But it's interesting because he ends up kind of failing to do so. But that's an interesting question, and I don't know much about Riga, but I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, it's very much west of St. Petersburg, and that's kind of,
Okay.
I mean, it is a smaller place.
Mhm.
It's definitely the kind of a more Western location, even though small and in the eyes of St. Petersburg, very provincial at the time.
Mhm. So
But
yeah, I mean, that's also interesting because Riga is still part of Russia, but if you were to look at it like, again, the underground man is representative of Russia and he's attempting to show his dominance over a Western counterpart. It's almost like he's fighting more of an interior battle, against how he sees himself rather than like fighting an actual Western foe because Riga's in Russia. So yeah, that's really interesting.
thank you, Camille. Shudi, is that still a hand? Oh, was that a hand?
Yes. Do we still have time for another question? Okay, thank you. So I have a question for Camille as well. Because when you were talking about Notes from Underground as some a mirror of Russian national identity in the face of the West. So I was wondering, do we have any first-hand sources of Dostoevsky's own words that can give us some clue about this intention? It is not that I am obsessed with authorial confirmation. It's just that what we know about the intertextuality of this novel is that it engaged in a debate with the work by Chernyshevsky, What is to be done, and that work can be taken as some westernizer stance, utopian project of an ideal mathematicalized world. So do you think that is what we are thinking about Notes from Underground, to see this novel as engaging in the polemics of a Slavophile and Westernizer?
So just to clarify, are you asking if Dostoevsky made like an intentional decision to make a point with this novel, in terms of the debate?
Yes, because it has been a while since I read this novel for the last time, and the only thing I was aware of is this intertextuality, and that is related to some Westernizer debate. Yeah.
Yeah, so I personally do think that Dostoevsky was making an intentional point as part of this debate, although I didn't come across any of his writing that said, this is what I'm doing with this book. There is plenty of reason to believe that he was commenting on that, given letters to friends and contemporary writers about his thoughts at the time, and specifically the time that it was written. He was going through his own significant ideologic shift. So I believe that that would have been at the forefront of his journalistic and fictional writing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
just to go back to the question of Riga, and it's interesting because I'm not sure if that was Katya's intention, but of course Riga is in Latvia, right? And so of course the whole question of kind of colonization comes up, right? And so the fact that Lisa is kind of from a kind of colonial periphery, right? So she is coming to the imperial center. Right. So that may also be significant. And what's interesting is, of course, the underground man is both sort of trying to prove his superiority over Lisa, but also kind of trapped by a sense of inferiority. Right. So that kind of double-edged national identity is often, in fact, really goes back to Chayadayev, who you cited, right? And this whole question, of course, we moved to the Brothers Karamazov, and that, of course, is belongs to a period of Dostoevsky's literary career when he is actually much more explicitly imperialist, right? So you find he's publishing a writer's diary in which you have articles saying why Russia should kind of invade, or it's sort of, first of all, of course, the Russo-Turkish war is going on. So there's a lot of kind of aggression in the Balkans, right? But at the same time, there's also interesting saber rattling by Dostoevsky about East Asia as well at that time, right? So there is this kind of whole question of kind of national identity that's also kind of playing out in this kind of double-edged way with Lisa, right? In terms of his, so I was just kind of just wanted to add that Camille kind of into the mix.
So I have a question then. I'm sorry, what was the name of the city again?
Riga.
Riga. Would that have
Mhm.
been part of Russia at the time of Dostoevsky's writing?
So it was part of the Russian Empire.
Okay.
Yeah, so part of the Russian Empire, right? But not necessarily part of Russia, right?
Right.
So it's kind
Yeah.
of because of course the Russian Empire is huge and it has these kind of contested areas. And so
Yeah.
Riga, the Baltic states are very much part of the contested territory, right? But of
Yeah.
course, a lot of the officials and so on, right? And there are in fact very powerful people in the bureaucracy who came from the Baltic areas, right? So Baltic Germans, for instance, so people of German descent, but who kind of came from those Baltic areas, were very high up in the imperial court and also in the bureaucracy. So they were kind of embedded in the power structures as well, right? So there's all kind of, in fact, I think that just makes it even more of an interesting question and even more of a kind of complex power relations going on there, right? That may be, and a lot of people now, because of the situation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of professors like us who are teaching Russian literature, we were kind of thinking a lot about these questions of kind of power and colonization and so on. So, and Chayadayev is a really important sort of link in that chain too.
Thank you, Kate, for clarifying my question. That was excellent. If no one else has a question at the moment, I would like to ask Oscar one thing. We know that Dostoevsky was very open to the idea of adaptation of his work to stage. In fact, I think it was after he wrote The Idiot, somebody approached him about him writing a play, adopted for theater, and he said, "Well, I can't." Paraphrasing Dostoevsky, it's a thankless task, but he basically said, "I'm not going to rewrite the novel, turn it into a play, but you should do it, and this is what you should do in your interpretation of the novel as a play." So he was very interested in the process. He didn't want to do it himself, but he would allow anyone to do it themselves, and he would even give pointers. So my question for you is, knowing how, well, because his premise was that once you adopt it for a different medium, it's a different work of art, but that doesn't mean that the message is invalid. You can still convey the same message just through different means. So in light of that, as you are essentially rewriting Dostoevsky, knowing that you cannot take everything from the novel and plop it into a different medium, what are the things that you are happy to leave out from your rewriting of Dostoevsky?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. So, I'm very glad you asked. I have no interest at all in filming any of the, not to spoil anything, but any of the central conflict. The central event, I will not be touching at all. Um, I really, what I'm thinking at this point, I really would like for it to be a series of extremely long one-on-one conversations. I think that this first scene, the opening scene, on paper it's 25 pages, but it took me the voice memo recording was an hour long, so it could be like in the range of like 45 minutes filmed, and that's one of the shorter dialogue scenes in the book. So I really I would like I think really what I want from a film of Brothers Karamazov, and why I'm approaching this is because I really just want to spend time with these characters. I want to be able to just sit with them and just experience just a moment, just listening to them talk. So I really the the sort of whatever narrative there is in the novel, I'll be leaving completely aside.
Interesting. Yeah, Natalie.
Yeah, I have another question for Oscar. In thinking about kind of the opposite a bit of like kind of the essentials of like what must remain and like how you approach that. I know that, for instance, the Grand Inquisitor is probably the most famous part of the Brothers Karamazov. Like people read it without reading the whole novel. And I was just curious how you would approach that because it's like a story within a story within a story. And it's like, I don't know, I can't. And I'm sure there's parts of the Brothers Karamazov that would be daunting to cover. I don't know if that's one area for you, like, and I'd be curious if there's others that kind of are daunting to approach adapting, but like, how would you go about approaching the like a reinterpretation of the Grand Inquisitor?
That's a very good question as well. I think so. The easy sort of answer, which I'm not interested in, which I don't like, but I think if Hollywood were to do an adaptation, they would probably, you know, bubble and oh, now we're in the Grand Inquisitor. Let's see the scene play out in front of us. I think that's silly. I think if I were to approach the same scene, um, I think it might be interesting, and this might be blasphemous. Not blasphemous in the religious sense, but in terms of Dostoevsky. Maybe writing a completely different story that's coming from a similar place. Um, but oh, claymation that'll be interesting as well. Or like Monty Python just goes into animation. That would also be interesting. But yeah, well, I actually I've thought before about certain things if there are places where I might it's silly for me to say this because there's so much material in the novel, but and the film will have so little of it, but it might be interesting to have scenes that we know happened but don't appear in the novel. Um, and in particular, I'm thinking of scenes that maybe foreshadow, and I won't spoil things again, but we know a little bit about what the second part would have been if he had lived to write it, how relationships turn out, and yeah, I won't say anymore. But maybe if there are scenes that sort of lead us in that direction, but again, I don't. But then uh, if I had to right now tell you, like, give you a specific answer for what the film looks like, one way to approach it would just be to have first scene between Lisa and Alyosha, and then the three meetings between Ivan and Smirdyakov, and then the final meeting, the conversation between Ivan and the devil, and then Alyosha coming back in. So that's one possible structure. I have no idea. It's possible when the film is finished, you'll say, "Oh, he did exactly that," or maybe it'll be completely different. I have no way of knowing.
Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, just to kind of continue with that line. So, and by the way, I agree with Shudi that you should absolutely do it. Hopefully, in a few years, we can all reconvene and watch your film together. Yeah, the one I mentioned before, this Turkish film director, and I spent quite a lot of the summer thinking about Turkish and Iranian adaptations of Dostoevsky's works, and also Chekhov's works, by the way. And when you were talking about how you want to have kind of these characters in conversation with each other, I immediately thought of Ceylan, the Turkish director, and he has a film called Winter Sleep, and in that film, it's based on two short stories by Chekhov, and also has a section, as you probably, it sounds like you know it. But in that film, so much time is taken up by characters talking to each other, and again, also the wonderful use of light and space also kind of contributes to this. But definitely, Ceylan could be a really good kind of inspiration for thinking about how to do these conversations.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you so much. And I realized after I said that he's that Winter Sleep is definitely a film that I would recommend to people as a good example of Dostoevsky.
Other thoughts? One thought occurred to me, Oscar, as you were speaking. I wondered if you tried having conversations with different characters with the help of ChatGPT and what they responded.
Absolutely not. I have never touched artificial intelligence, and I will not. I have decided it's better if I just don't go anywhere near it. I want people to be able to trust that everything that comes from me is coming from me as a human being. That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Just to respond to that. So some of you might know our blog, the Bloggers Karamazov, which is the North American Dostoevsky Society's website. And we have been having an undergraduate series, by the way, which you should all consider submitting to, because you just gave such great papers. And one of the recent entries for that was about, in fact, a student at Duke University who does AI, but also took a course on the Brothers Karamazov. He produced a kind of some kind of a simulation whereby you could actually have conversations with the characters using the kind of basically using the text. So kind of interfacing. I'll put that in the chat too. But obviously a completely different, as you rightly put it, experience from what you're thinking about, but might be amusing to read.
Okay,
And
any final thoughts? I think we can adjourn and take a break.